When we imagine the Roman Empire, we often conjure images of disciplined legions marching across continents, their eagle standards glinting in the sun. We think of monumental structures like the Colosseum and aqueducts that defied the limits of ancient engineering. While military might and architectural genius were certainly pillars of Roman power, they were not the foundation. Beneath the surface of conquest and construction lay a complex and often ruthless financial system. This system, built on debt, strategic exploitation, and monetary manipulation, was the true engine that fueled Rome's expansion from a small city-state into a world-spanning empire. Understanding this economic machinery is crucial because Rome's story is not just one of swords and sandals. It is a profound lesson in how money can build, sustain, and ultimately destroy great power. The genius of the Romans was not simply in winning battles, but in making those battles profitable. They understood that an army requires a constant flow of resources, weapons, food, and most importantly, pay. Early on, this was a simpler affair, but as Rome's ambitions grew, its financial needs exploded. The state developed an intricate relationship with its wealthiest citizens, turning them into investors in the imperial project. War was not just a matter of patriotic duty, it became a business opportunity. This transformation of warfare into a source of immense wealth for a select few, while funding the state's continued growth, created a self-perpetuating cycle where more conquest was always the answer to financial shortfalls. It was a brilliant if precarious model for empire building. This financial architecture was not without its deep flaws. The reliance on continuous expansion meant that the empire's economic health was tied to its ability to find new lands to plunder and new populations to tax. When the frontiers ceased to advance, the system began to falter. To cover its expenses, the state resorted to increasingly desperate measures, including devaluing its own currency, a trick that had devastating consequences for ordinary people. This created a widening chasm between the super-rich, who could protect their wealth in land and other tangible assets, and the common citizens, whose savings were eroded by inflation. The internal economic pressures began to mount, proving just as dangerous as any barbarian horde at the gates. Ultimately, the story of Rome's rise and fall is a cautionary tale about the limits of a system predicated on perpetual growth and financial engineering. It demonstrates that an empire's greatest vulnerabilities can be internal, stemming from the very policies that once made it strong. The methods Rome used, leveraging public debt, privatizing state functions like tax collection, and manipulating the money supply, are not merely relics of the ancient world. They echo in the policies of modern nations today, raising similar questions about sustainability, inequality, and the long-term stability of our own complex economic systems. By examining Rome's secret money tricks, we gain a clearer perspective on the timeless patterns of power and finance. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the army was a reflection of its society, a militia of citizen farmers. When duty called, men who owned a sufficient amount of land were expected to leave their fields, provide their own weapons and armor, and fight for the defense of Rome. This model was rooted in the ideal of the citizen soldier, whose loyalty to the state was intertwined with his ownership of a piece of it. Campaigns were typically short and fought close to home, allowing these men to return in time for the harvest. This system worked well for a small city-state engaged in local conflicts, as the soldiers had a direct, personal stake in protecting their homes and livelihoods. Their service was a temporary civic obligation, not a career. However, as Rome's influence and territory began to expand across the Italian peninsula and beyond, this citizen militia model became unsustainable. Wars became longer, lasting for years instead of a single season. The battlefields moved farther and farther from home, from Sicily to Spain to North Africa. A farmer from central Italy could not simply abandon his land for half a decade to fight in a distant province. His farm would fall into ruin, and his family would starve. The state recognized that to maintain its military campaigns, it needed a more reliable and permanent fighting force. The solution was a fundamental transformation of the Roman military, the move toward a professional, state-funded army, where service became a long-term occupation. This crucial change, often associated with the reforms of Gaius Marius around 107 BC, opened the ranks of the army to the I-corps, the landless poor who had previously been excluded from service. Instead of soldiers paying for their own gear, the state began to provide equipment and, most importantly, a regular salary, or this created a standing army of professional soldiers who were loyal not to their farms or a local region, but to the general who paid them and promised them rewards. These rewards often included a share of the spoils of war and a plot of land upon retirement. This professionalization made the Roman army the most formidable fighting machine in the ancient world, capable of sustained, long-distance campaigns. The shift to a paid, professional army had profound and lasting consequences for Roman society and its financial structure. It created a massive and continuous expense for the state treasury. The need to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers became one of the government's largest and most non-negotiable budget items. This immense financial pressure forced Rome to adopt a more aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. The state now had a powerful incentive to seek out new conquests, not just for strategic advantage, but to acquire the necessary funds, in the form of loot, slaves, and new taxable provinces, to pay for the very army that enabled the conquests. The professional soldier, in essence, became both the tool of expansion and the reason for it. With a large professional army on its payroll, the Roman state faced a relentless financial challenge: how to fund its ever-growing military budget. The answer was found in the very act of warfare itself. Conquest was not merely a geopolitical strategy. It became the central pillar of the Roman economic model. Each successful campaign was expected to generate more revenue than it cost to wage, creating a powerful cycle where war was used to pay for more war. When a new territory was conquered, it was systematically stripped of its wealth, which was then funneled back to Rome. This plunder took many forms, from immediate spoils of battle to long-term sources of income that would fill the state's coffers for generations to come. The most immediate return on a military investment came from the direct looting of conquered cities and the enslavement of their populations. Victorious generals would seize vast quantities of gold, silver, art, and other precious goods, which were paraded through the streets of Rome during a triumphal procession before being deposited in the state treasury. The human cost was staggering. Entire populations were sold into slavery, with the proceeds from these sales providing a massive injection of cash. For example, the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar is said to have brought 1 million people into the slave markets, generating immense profits for both Caesar and the Roman state. This brutal extraction of wealth was a critical source of short-term funding that could finance ongoing military operations. Beyond the initial plunder, conquered provinces became long-term cash cows for the empire. Once a region was pacified and incorporated into the Roman world, it was subjected to regular taxation. These taxes could be levied on land, agricultural produce, and trade, creating a steady and predictable stream of revenue that flowed into the treasury year after year. Furthermore, Rome often seized control of valuable natural resources within these new territories, such as the rich gold and silver mines in Spain. These mines were exploited on an industrial scale, using slave labor to extract precious metals that were then used to mint new coins, further fueling the economic engine of the empire. The taxes and resources from the provinces were essential for paying soldiers, funding public works, and sustaining the Roman state. This economic model, where expansion was necessary to maintain financial stability, created a state that was perpetually geared for war. The logic was inescapable. If the army needed to be paid, and the best way to get money was through conquest, then the legions must always be on the move. This created a powerful feedback loop where the military, the political elite, and the financial class all had a vested interest in continued expansion. A successful general brought glory to Rome, riches to the treasury, and profits to his backers. Peace, in this context, was economically undesirable, as it would mean an end to the flow of new wealth. The empire's survival became dependent on its ability to constantly find new targets to conquer and exploit. While taxes and the spoils of war provided significant income, they were often not enough to cover the colossal upfront costs of a major military campaign. Mobilizing, equipping, and supplying tens of thousands of soldiers for a war that could last for years required an enormous amount of capital. To bridge this gap, the Roman state relied heavily on a surprisingly modern financial tool: public debt. Rome frequently borrowed massive sums of money from its own wealthiest citizens. This was not a simple act of patriotism. It was a sophisticated investment arrangement where the rich lent money to the state with the expectation of making a handsome profit from the venture of war. This system of public borrowing was essential to financing Rome's most ambitious undertakings. The primary lenders to the Roman state were members of the elite, particularly the senatorial class and a class of wealthy businessmen and financiers. During times of crisis, such as the devastating Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic would issue appeals for public loans. Wealthy individuals would contribute from their private fortunes to fund the war effort. These loans were not donations. The investors fully expected to be repaid with interest once the war was won, and the expected riches from the conquered territory began to flow back to Rome. This created a powerful partnership between the state and its financial elite, where the wealthy underwrote the risks of war in exchange for a share of its rewards. The returns for these elite investors came in various forms, going far beyond simple interest payments. One of the most lucrative rewards was the right to engage in tax farming. Instead of creating a large government bureaucracy to collect taxes in the provinces, the state auctioned off the rights to tax collection to private companies known as. These companies, run by the same who lent money to the state, would pay a lump sum to the treasury for the right to collect taxes in a specific region. They were then free to collect as much as they could from the local population, and any amount they collected above what they had paid to the state was pure profit. This system was notoriously corrupt and exploitative, but it was incredibly profitable for the investors and provided the state with immediate cash. This reliance on public debt fundamentally shaped Roman politics and society. It gave the wealthy a direct financial stake in the success of military expansion, creating a powerful lobby for aggressive foreign policy. Senators and generals, who could promise profitable wars, were more likely to gain political support and financial backing from the elite. This turned the state into a vehicle for private enrichment, blurring the lines between public service and personal gain. The system effectively privatized many of the costs and profits of empire building, ensuring that those with the most capital were also the ones who benefited most from Rome's imperial project. The legions marched on borrowed money, and the price of victory was paid back with interest to the richest men in Rome. The deep financial entanglement of the Roman state with its wealthy elite created what could be described as an ancient military-industrial complex. War was not just a political act, it became, honestly, the most profitable business in the empire. A powerful network of senators, generals, financiers, and contractors emerged, all of whom had a strong vested interest in, perpetual conflict. This system transformed the very nature of Roman power, shifting political influence towards those who could command armies and deliver the spoils of war. The drive for personal profit and the needs of the state became dangerously intertwined, making continuous military expansion seem like a natural and necessary condition of Roman life. At the heart of this system were the generals, who evolved from public servants into powerful warlords with private armies. A successful campaign could make a general fabulously wealthy. He was entitled to a significant portion of the spoils, which he could use to reward his soldiers, solidifying their personal loyalty to him rather than to the state in Rome. Figures like Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, amassed personal fortunes that rivaled the entire state treasury. This immense wealth gave them unparalleled political influence, allowing them to fund lavish games for the public, bribe officials, and maintain their armies. Political power in the late Republic became less about senatorial debate and more about which man commanded the most legions and, honestly, the deepest pockets. The private contractors who managed tax collection, were another key component of this complex. Their role extended far beyond simply collecting taxes. They were also responsible for supplying the armies with everything from grain and weapons to clothing and construction materials. They operated the mines seized in conquered territories and managed vast public contracts. This made them indispensable to the war effort and allowed them to accumulate enormous wealth and influence. Because their profits were directly tied to military operations and provincial administration, they consistently pushed for policies that favored expansion and exploitation, often at the expense of the provincials they governed and the long-term stability of the empire. This privatization of warfare and state logistics created a society where violence was, frankly, incentivized and institutionalized. The Senate, in many ways, began to resemble a board of directors for Rome Inc., with its members acting as shareholders in a violent enterprise. Decisions about war and peace were increasingly influenced by financial calculations. Which campaign would offer the best return on investment? Which new province held the most valuable resources to be exploited? This commercialization of conquest concentrated immense wealth and power in the hands of a few, while the risks and costs were borne by the common soldiers on the battlefield and the taxpayers back home. The Republic was slowly being consumed by the very system of profitable warfare that had made it so powerful. For centuries, the Roman economy was underpinned by a stable and trusted currency, most notably the silver denarius. This coin contained a high percentage of pure silver, and its value was accepted across the vast expanse of the empire. However, as the empire reached its territorial limits and the flow of new wealth from conquests began to slow down, the state found it increasingly difficult to meet its massive financial obligations, especially the payroll for its army. Faced with a chronic shortage of gold and silver, emperors began to resort to a deceptive and ultimately destructive financial trick currency debasement. This was the ancient world's equivalent of printing money. The process of debasement was simple. To produce more coins with the same amount of precious metal, the mint would mix the silver with less valuable base metals like copper or bronze. The coin still looked like a denarius and was legally declared to have the same value, but its intrinsic worth was significantly lower. This practice began in earnest under the reign of Emperor Nero in the 1st century AD, who reduced the silver content of the denarius from nearly 100% to about 90%. While this provided a short-term solution to the treasury's problems, it set a dangerous precedent. Subsequent emperors, facing their own financial crises, would repeat and accelerate the process. Over the next 2 centuries, the debasement became progressively worse. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, the Roman monetary system was in freefall. The denarius, once a symbol of Roman economic strength, had become little more than a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. Some coins contained as little as 2% silver. The government was essentially creating money out of thin air to pay its soldiers and officials. This massive increase in the money supply, without a corresponding increase in the amount of available goods and services, led to runaway inflation. prices for everyday necessities like grain, oil, and clothing skyrocketed across the empire. The consequences of this hyperinflation were catastrophic. People quickly lost faith in the currency. A soldier's pay, which might have been adequate at the beginning of the year, was worth a fraction of its value by the end. Merchants and farmers were reluctant to accept coins that they knew were virtually worthless, leading to a breakdown in trade and a return to a more primitive barter economy in some regions. The government's attempt to solve its financial problems by manipulating the currency had backfired spectacularly, destroying public trust, crippling the economy, and creating widespread social and political instability. The debased denarius became a symbol of the empire's internal decay. The financial policies of the late Roman Empire, particularly the rampant currency debasement and the exploitative tax system, did not affect all members of society equally. While these measures were intended to keep the state afloat, they placed a crushing burden on the lower and middle classes, the small farmers, artisans, merchants, and soldiers. The wealthy elite, on the other hand, had the means and the political connections to shield themselves from the worst effects of the economic crisis. This resulted in a dramatic widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, fostering deep social resentment and contributing to the unraveling of the social fabric that had once held the empire together. The primary way the wealthy protected their fortunes was by moving their assets out of the rapidly devaluing currency. Instead of holding large amounts of cash, the rich invested in tangible assets that would hold their value regardless of inflation. They bought up vast tracts of land, creating enormous agricultural estates known as latifundia. They invested in luxury goods, slaves, and grand city villas and country estates. Because their wealth was tied up in real property, not in coins whose silver content was plummeting, they were largely insulated from the hyperinflation that was destroying the savings of ordinary people. A farmer who had saved a lifetime's worth of denarii found his nest egg reduced to worthlessness, while the landlord to whom he paid rent saw the value of his estate remain stable or even increase. Furthermore, the political influence of the elite often allowed them to secure tax exemptions or to shift the tax burden onto others. While the state's need for revenue grew more desperate, powerful senators and landowners could often negotiate special treatment, ensuring their estates were not taxed at the full rate. The burden of taxation therefore fell most heavily on those least able to pay. Small landowners were often taxed into bankruptcy, forced to sell their land to their wealthy neighbors for a pittance, and become tenant farmers, or kolonai, on the very land they once owned. This process accelerated the concentration of land and wealth into the hands of a tiny minority, effectively reducing a large portion of the rural population to a state of semi-serfdom. For the common citizen, the combination of soaring prices and heavy taxes was devastating. A soldier's fixed salary could no longer buy enough food to feed his family. An artisan's wages were worthless by the time he went to the market. The government's response was often to demand taxes be paid, not in worthless coin, but in kind, in the form of grain, livestock, or other goods, which were then used to supply the army. This placed a direct and crippling burden on agricultural producers. The economic system, which had once offered a degree of stability, now seemed rigged in favor of the rich, creating a society marked by profound inequality and despair for the masses. The entire Roman financial system, built on conquest, debt, and exploitation, had one critical vulnerability. It required constant expansion to function. The steady influx of wealth from new territories was the fuel that kept the machine running. It paid the interest on loans, provided land for retiring soldiers, and supplied the gold and silver needed to mint new coins and pay the army. For centuries, this model worked, but eventually, the empire reached its practical limits. It ran out of wealthy, easily conquerable neighbors. The frontiers stabilized along formidable natural barriers like the Rhine and Danube rivers, and the deserts of the east. The era of profitable expansion was over. When the flow of plunder dried up, the state's chronic financial problems became an acute crisis. The government still had to pay its massive army and bureaucracy, but its primary source of new income had vanished. Without new gold and silver mines to exploit, the emperors turned inward, seeking to extract the necessary resources from the empire's existing population. This marked a fundamental shift in the state's relationship with its citizens. The government, once a purveyor of peace and stability, the Pax Romana, became increasingly predatory. Taxation grew heavier and more aggressive, and the currency debasement that had begun centuries earlier was pushed to its absolute limit, leading to the hyperinflation of the 3rd century. The social and political consequences of this breakdown were severe. The state's desperate need for revenue led to increasingly authoritarian measures. To ensure a stable supply of goods and labor, the government began to lock people into their professions. A baker's son was forced to become a baker. A soldier's son was conscripted into the army. Tenant farmers, the colony, were legally tied to the land they worked, unable to leave. This created a rigid, caste-like society that stifled social mobility and economic freedom. The state, in its effort to save itself, was crushing its own people. Public services, from road maintenance to the famous bread and circuses that kept the urban poor placated, began to collapse as the treasury was emptied. Ultimately, the failure of the financial system led to a hollowing out of the empire from within. Widespread corruption, crippling taxation, and a worthless currency eroded public loyalty and made central governance nearly impossible. The empire began to fracture as powerful generals and provincial landowners took matters into their own hands, effectively creating their own local fiefdoms. While we often point to barbarian invasions as the cause of Rome's fall, the reality is that the invaders were pushing against a structure that was already rotten from the inside. The financial math had stopped working. The empire did not simply fall because it was attacked. It collapsed under the weight of its own insoluble economic contradictions. The story of Rome's financial rise and fall is not just a fascinating piece of ancient history. It serves as a powerful and relevant allegory for the economic challenges facing the modern world. The specific technologies and institutions have changed, but the fundamental principles of money, debt, and power remain remarkably similar. Modern nations like the Roman Empire rely on complex financial systems to project power and maintain social order. By examining the choices Rome made and the consequences that followed, we can see clear parallels to our own time, particularly in the areas of government debt, currency management, and the social effects of economic policy. The echoes of Rome are all around us. One of the most striking parallels is the reliance on massive public debt. The Roman state borrowed heavily from its elite to finance its wars, creating a powerful class of creditors with a vested interest in state policy. Today, governments around the world, particularly in the West, run colossal budget deficits, funded by selling bonds to investors, corporations, and other countries. Major expenditures, such as prolonged military conflicts or extensive social programs, are often paid for, not with current tax revenues, but with borrowed money, pushing the financial burden onto future generations. This dependence on debt creates a similar dynamic, where financial markets and the interests of large creditors can exert immense influence over government decisions, blurring the line between public good and private profit. The Roman practice of currency debasement also has a modern equivalent, though it is executed with far more sophistication. Instead of mixing copper into silver coins, modern central banks can engage in what is known as quantitative easing or expansive monetary policy. In essence, They create new money electronically to buy government bonds and other financial assets, injecting liquidity into the economy. While intended to stimulate growth or prevent financial collapse, this expansion of the money supply carries the same risk as Roman debasement. It can devalue the currency and lead to inflation, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens' savings and wages. The debate over how much money a central bank can print without triggering hyperinflation is a direct descendant of the dilemma faced by Roman emperors. Finally, the social consequences of these financial policies in Rome, the widening gap between a protected elite and a struggling populace, resonate deeply today. Modern economic policies can also lead to increased wealth inequality. For instance, low interest rates and quantitative easing tend to inflate the value of assets like stocks and real estate, which are primarily owned by the wealthy. Meanwhile, the resulting inflation in consumer goods disproportionately harms lower and middle-income households, whose wealth is in cash savings or fixed wages. The Roman lesson is that when a financial system consistently benefits a small elite at the expense of the broader population, it can lead to social unrest, a loss of faith in institutions, and deep political polarization. The fall of Rome reminds us that no empire is too big to fail, and that economic decay from within is often the most formidable threat of all.